A quiet morning in paradise turned into a storm of fire. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific became a graveyard of steel. This is where the world changed forever. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning broke warm and still over Oahu. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and hibiscus through the naval base at Pearl Harbor. The sea was calm, reflecting the pale gold of the rising sun. Seagulls circled lazily above the anchored ships, massive silhouettes of American pride and steel. On the deck of the U.S. Arizona, Seaman Daniel Carter leaned on the railing, a cup of coffee in his hand, unaware that the world he knew was about to ignite. Far above the horizon, a faint hum grew louder, at first mistaken for the drone of distant engines or training flights. But to the north, hundreds of aircraft were slicing through the morning sky in tight formation. In their cockpits, Japanese pilots checked watches synchronized to Tokyo time. Commander Fuchida Mitsuo gave the signal. The rising sun banners gleamed crimson under the dawn light. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave descended. Torpedoes cut through the harbor waters like silver daggers. The stillness shattered. Explosions erupted across Battleship Row, pillars of fire and smoke punching into the air. Carter dropped his cup as the Arizona trembled beneath him. A deep metallic groan, followed by a blinding flash. Men scrambled across decks, shouting orders, returning fire with trembling hands. But the enemy was invisible, striking from the sky, swift and merciless. Sirens wailed across Ford Island. Black smoke rolled over the bay. The Oklahoma capsized within minutes. The West Virginia burned from bow to stern. Anti-aircraft guns barked defiantly, their tracers chasing shadows in the clouds. Carter and a handful of sailors fought to free the wounded from the lower decks, the air thick with oil and blood. Above them, Japanese Zero fighters strafed the docks, their machine guns cutting through rows of men. In the chaos, Commander Fuchida circled high above the harbor, radioing one word to the fleet. Tora, 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 the signal of complete surprise. Below, the once peaceful base had become a furnace of twisted metal and human screams. The American Pacific Fleet, the pride of the nation, was dying in its cradle. By 9 a.m., the sky over Hawaii had turned black. The sea burned. Ships lay half submerged, flags still fluttering amid the flames. Carter, his uniform torn and face streaked with soot, stared toward the horizon, where the smoke met the rising sun. In that moment, he understood. The world had changed forever. By mid-morning, Pearl Harbor had fallen silent, except for the groan of burning ships and the cries of the wounded. The smell of oil, smoke, and scorched flesh clung to the air like a physical weight. Across the base, medics and sailors moved like ghosts through the wreckage, pulling bodies from the water, shouting names that vanished beneath the crackle of fire. Daniel Carter staggered along what remained of the Arizona's deck, the steel twisted and hot beneath his boots. He had lost his helmet somewhere amid the blasts. His left arm was bleeding from shrapnel, but he felt nothing, his senses numb, his mind locked on survival. A nearby explosion from a ruptured fuel line sent a wall of flame across the ship's stern. Carter threw himself into the oily water below, gasping as heat seared the back of his neck. In the harbor, the sea itself was on fire. Lifeboats overturned, men clung to debris slick with fuel, their faces half hidden under the smoke. Overhead, the second wave of Japanese aircraft swept in at 8:55 a.m., diving low over Ford Island. Torpedoes struck again, followed by a chain of secondary explosions that rattled every window on Oahu. At the airfield, Lieutenant Raymond Brooks, a young American pilot, ran toward his fighter, one of the few still intact. Enemy bullets chewed the ground around him as he climbed into the cockpit. He had no time for orders. The radio tower had been destroyed. With sheer instinct, he started the engine and roared down the runway under fire. A Japanese Zero cut across his path. Brooks fired a burst, saw the enemy plane spiral into the bay. Then another shadow fell upon him from above. The next second, his canopy shattered, and the world dissolved into blinding light. By 10 a.m., the attack was over. The Japanese fleet turned away, their pilots cheering victory. In 2 hours, they had sunk or crippled 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 aircraft, and killed more than 2,000 Americans. Back on shore, Carter dragged himself through the wreckage, past bodies covered with tarps, past ships that would never sail again. He looked around at the destruction and felt something colder than fear. Resolve. This wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Behind him, the Arizona still burned, the sound of its dying engines echoing across the harbor. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, the rising sun faded into the clouds, and America, wounded but unbroken, began to stir. That night, Pearl Harbor burned like a floating city of embers. The sky glowed crimson, reflected in the oil-slick waters that carried the bodies of sailors back and forth with the tide. The survivors worked by lantern light, clearing debris, hauling wounded men to the shore. Every clang of metal, every groan from the dying, was a grim reminder that the Pacific Fleet, once the pride of America, now lay crippled beneath the waves. Daniel Carter sat on a pier, his uniform stiff with salt and smoke, his hands trembling around a tin mug of cold coffee. Around him, the air buzzed with the murmur of disbelief. Officers took roll calls that returned silence after silence. In the distance, flames still consumed the Arizona, marking her grave with a column of smoke that seemed to pierce the heavens. On the mainland, the news struck like a thunderclap. Radios crackled across America. Pearl Harbor attacked. Heavy losses. People stopped in streets and stores, frozen by the impossible words. In New York, in Chicago, in the quiet towns of Kansas and Ohio, men looked to the west with clenched jaws. Women wept quietly over kitchen tables. The illusion of distance, that the war in Europe and Asia was a world away, shattered in a single morning. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt gathered his advisors before dawn. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke, the faces around the table pale and sleepless. Intelligence officers laid photographs on the desk. Wrecked ships, columns of smoke, casualty estimates. No one spoke for a long time. Then Roosevelt, his voice hoarse, said simply, "We are at war." The next day, December 8, 1941, the Capitol trembled under the roar of voices. Roosevelt stood before Congress and the nation, his hand gripping the podium. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. His words rolled like thunder through the radio waves, reaching every farmhouse and city street. By the time he finished, America was no longer a bystander. It was a nation awakened, unified by fury and grief. Back in Hawaii, as dawn broke again, Carter stood among the wrecks and raised his eyes to the rising sun. The air was heavy with smoke and salt, but he could feel something beneath the despair. Movement, purpose, momentum. Behind him, the sound of hammers began. Men were already rebuilding. The Pacific had drawn blood, but it had also forged resolve. The dawn of fire had come. The storm to follow would burn even brighter. The wind over the Pacific carried a taste of salt and war. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, yet for many sailors and airmen, the memory was as fresh as the smoke that once hung over Hawaii. The United States had not only risen from its knees, it had become a machine, vast and relentless. Shipyards thundered day and night. New carriers slid into the water like beasts reborn from molten steel. The nation that had once bled was now sharpening its claws. Aboard the USS Enterprise, the air was heavy with anticipation. The carrier's deck groaned under the weight of armed bombers and fighters, their fuselages painted with the white star of America. Mechanics worked in near silence, their movements practiced and deliberate. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, blue and deceptive, hiding an enemy fleet somewhere beyond the horizon. Ensign Raymond Brooks, his head still bandaged from a scar earned at Pearl Harbor, adjusted his goggles as he waited beside his aircraft. He had been one of the few who survived that morning of fire. Now he was about to face the enemy again, not in defense but in pursuit. The plan was bold. Intelligence had cracked Japan's naval codes, revealing their next target, the small atoll of Midway, a stepping stone across the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz had chosen to gamble everything. 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, would lie in wait, hidden among the waves, poised to ambush the might of the Imperial Navy. On the opposite side of the ocean, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto studied the same expanse of blue from the deck of his flagship, Yamato. He knew the Americans were rebuilding faster than anyone had expected. His fleet was still formidable, 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, in the pride of Japan's Navy, but he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing behind his calm expression. "Strike first, strike hard, and end this war," he murmured to his officers. Yet even he could sense the tide beginning to shift. As dawn approached on June 4, 1942, clouds rolled low over the Pacific. Brooks climbed into his cockpit. Around him, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. No speeches, no bravado, only readiness. Over the radio, the signal came through. "Enemy sighted." Engines roared to life. The deck officers gave the launch order. The first American planes leapt into the gray morning, their propellers slicing the wind. Below, sailors watched them disappear into the horizon, a thin line of steel and willpower flying toward destiny. Somewhere beyond those clouds, the empire that had set Pearl Harbor aflame was waiting. The sky above Midway was a furnace of sun and smoke. By 10 a.m. on June 4th, the first waves of American torpedo bombers had already been slaughtered. They flew low and slow, their outdated planes torn apart by swarms of Japanese Zeros. Pilots died before releasing their payloads, their aircraft erupting into fireballs that vanished into the sea. But their sacrifice was not in vain. They had drawn the enemy fighters down to sea level, leaving the sky above momentarily unguarded. High above the chaos, Ensign Raymond Brooks and his dive bomber squadron spotted the Japanese fleet through the haze. 4 carriers, perfectly aligned, their decks crowded with refueling planes and bombs ready for the next strike. Over the radio, the voice of their leader, Lieutenant Wade McCluskey, came through, calm but urgent. "This is it, boys. Make it count." Brooks adjusted his oxygen mask, his heart pounding like a drum. The target loomed below. The carrier Kaga, massive and gleaming under the morning sun. "Dive, dive, dive!" The order snapped through his headset. Brooks pushed the control stick forward, and the world tilted into a vertical blur. The rush of air screamed past his canopy as the ocean spun upward. At 15,000 feet, he began his descent. Anti-aircraft shells burst around him like black flowers. Shrapnel rattled against his wings. Smoke streaked his visor. He locked his sights on the ship's deck, a single narrow rectangle amid the inferno. "Steady," he whispered. At 1,500 feet, he released his bomb and pulled hard on the stick. His body slammed into the seat as the plane clawed for altitude. A second later, a blinding flash engulfed the Kaga. The bomb tore through the flight deck, igniting fuel lines and detonating armed torpedoes below. Within minutes, fire spread across the ship, consuming everything in its path. One by one, the other American squadrons found their marks. Akagi, Soryu, and Kaga erupted in pillars of flame that reached into the sky. Brooks circled back, watching the ocean churn with debris and smoke. The sight was unreal. The same empire that had struck Pearl Harbor now burned under American bombs. Over the radio, voices shouted through static, "Direct hit!" Multiple carriers burning. Cheers filled the cockpit, but Brooks couldn't bring himself to join. He thought of the men below. Men fighting fires, men who would never make it home. By afternoon, the tide had turned. Only one Japanese carrier, Hiryu, remained operational, and she too would soon be hunted down. The Pacific, once ruled by the rising sun, was beginning to reflect a different light. As the surviving planes returned to the Enterprise, sailors cheered from the deck, their faces streaked with oil and tears. Brooks climbed out of his bomber, exhausted and shaking. Around him, the air smelled of fuel and salt, but also, for the first time, of victory. The battle for Midway was over. The cost had been terrible, but the message was clear. America would not fall. By dawn on June 5th, 1942, the Pacific had calmed again, but the ocean was littered with wreckage, burned timbers, oil slicks, and the faint glimmer of life rafts adrift among the waves. The once invincible Japanese fleet was retreating westward, its proud carriers now smoking ruins beneath the sea. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the heavy, breathless pause that follows catastrophe. Aboard the USS Enterprise, men moved like machines, their bodies running on exhaustion and adrenaline. Mechanics rearmed aircraft, medics tended to burned and bloodied pilots, and officers pored over maps still wet with coffee and sweat. The victory at Midway had come at a price. Dozens of American planes lost, hundreds of men dead, but it had cracked Japan's naval spine. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Stars and Stripes flew over the Pacific without shame. Raymond Brooks stood near the rail, his flight suit unzipped to his waist, wind tugging at his hair. He watched the sunrise blaze across the horizon, lighting the smoke that still lingered in the distance. His hands still trembled from the day before. He had killed men he could not see. He had watched ships die. The triumph everyone felt around him was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. In Washington, news of the victory electrified the nation. Newspapers screamed headlines across the front pages. Japan defeated at Midway. 4 carriers sunk. The same citizens who had stood in silence 6 months earlier now filled streets waving flags. For the first time since that day of infamy, America felt momentum shift beneath its feet. Factories increased production. Young men lined up at recruitment offices. The war machine was alive. Admiral Yamamoto received the report aboard his flagship with expressionless calm. He read each dispatch in silence, then set the papers down. Around him, his officers stood stiffly, awaiting his command. "We have awakened a sleeping giant," he said quietly, and filled him with a terrible resolve. No one spoke after that. The weight of his words hung over the sea like mist. Back on the Enterprise, a bell rang across the deck. Planes were being prepared again, their engines warming for the next mission. The war would move south, to the Solomon Islands, to Guadalcanal, a new front where jungle, hunger, and exhaustion would test every soldier. As Brooks turned away from the railing, Daniel Carter passed by, now serving aboard the same carrier as part of the deck crew. Their eyes met briefly, one a pilot, the other a survivor. No words were needed. Both understood what lay ahead, a long road paved in steel and blood. The victory at Midway was not the end. It was the hinge on which the war would turn, a small island that changed the fate of nations. And as the Enterprise cut through the waves toward the next horizon, the men aboard knew the Pacific was far from done burning. The Solomon Islands lay under a ceiling of gray clouds, the sea below restless and green. After weeks of steaming south from Pearl Harbor, the American fleet approached the unknown. Guadalcanal, a name few had heard, but that would soon be etched in blood. The objective was clear: seize the airfield the Japanese were building there, a potential dagger pointed at Australia. But no one truly knew what waited beyond those jungles. At dawn on August 7th, 1942, the first U.S. Marines landed on the beaches. The surf hissed against the sand, the humidity pressing like a fist. Daniel Carter, transferred from the Enterprise as part of the logistics crew supporting the invasion, helped unload crates of ammunition under the roar of naval guns. His skin was burned by sun and salt, his nerves taut as steel wire. He had seen fire before and met Pearl Harbor, but here the danger was everywhere and invisible. The Japanese had vanished into the jungle, leaving behind a half-built airstrip and scattered supplies. For a moment, some men dared to believe the landing would be easy. They were wrong. By nightfall, the trees themselves seemed to come alive. Sniper fire cracked from the darkness. Mortar shells fell like thunder among the tents. Screams echoed, short and sharp, then were swallowed by the rain. Far offshore, the USS Enterprise and the carrier group provided cover. In the dimly lit ready room, Lieutenant Raymond Brooks studied reconnaissance photos. The narrow beaches, the dense vegetation, the serpentine river cutting through the island's heart. He had orders to fly dawn patrols, searching for Japanese reinforcements. The faces of his men were drawn, eyes ringed by sleepless nights. "We're not fighting ships anymore," he said quietly. "We're fighting ghosts." The next morning, Brooks launched his plane into the humid air. Below him, the jungle canopy rippled in the wind like dark water. He spotted flashes of movement along the river. Columns of Japanese soldiers moving with eerie silence, camouflaged in green and mud. Over the radio, he relayed coordinates to the destroyers offshore. Within minutes, shells whistled overhead, exploding in bursts that shook the island. On the ground, Carter flinched as the bombardment thundered beyond the tree line. Leaves rained down like ash. The Marines advanced, faces painted with grime, rifles raised. Each step forward was met with sudden violence. A sniper's shot, a grenade, a scream. The island seemed to breathe war. By nightfall, rain poured in torrents, washing blood into the mud. Carter crouched in a foxhole beside a young Marine barely 20, both shivering despite the heat. "You think they'll come again?" the Marine asked. Carter didn't answer. Somewhere in the darkness, a Japanese bugle wailed. The answer came in gunfire. By the third week of August, Guadalcanal had devoured its first men. The jungle seemed alive, thick, steaming, and hostile to every breath. Malaria swarmed in clouds of mosquitoes. Rot crept through boots and uniforms. Men learned to sleep with rifles across their chests, half awake to the rustle of leaves. The enemy rarely appeared in daylight but struck without warning in the night, their shouts and gunfire slicing through the rain. Daniel Carter had become leaner, harder, his once carefree face now carved by exhaustion. He worked with a supply team on the airstrip that the Americans now called Henderson Field. Every hour they fought not just the Japanese, but hunger and exhaustion. Food came irregularly. Ammunition arrived soaked. The nights belonged to fear. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the palms, the low drone of aircraft engines rolled in from the sea. "Incoming!" someone shouted. Carter dove behind a sandbag wall as Japanese bombers screamed overhead, dropping their loads in quick succession. The explosions ripped the earth apart, flinging dirt and metal into the air. The entire sky seemed to roar. When the attack ended, the field was cratered, the supply depot burning. Carter's hands shook as he dug through debris for survivors, pulling out a wounded Marine pinned beneath a beam. Offshore, the U.S. Navy fought to keep the supply lines open, but the waters around Guadalcanal were cursed. At night, Japanese destroyers, nicknamed Tokyo Express, slipped through the darkness, shelling the beaches and vanishing before dawn. One by one, American ships went down, turning the surrounding sea into a graveyard of steel. Lieutenant Raymond Brooks flew daily patrols from the Enterprise, now stationed east of the island. The missions blurred into one another. Dogfights at sunrise, bombing runs at noon, recovery of the wounded before dusk. The Japanese pilots were relentless, skilled, and willing to die. Brooks lost friends almost every day. He stopped learning their names. It hurt too much. On August 24th, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons erupted. Brooks launched with a full payload, his bomber trembling as it climbed. Clouds parted to reveal a distant formation of Japanese carriers. The radio filled with static and shouting. Enemy fleet sighted. Attack vectors confirmed Brooks dove through flak, released his bombs, and pulled up just in time to see one carrier erupt in flame. But the price was high. The Enterprise herself took 2 direct hits before limping away under smoke. When Brooks landed, the deck was slick with oil and blood. Fires burned unchecked along the hangar bay. He pulled off his gloves, his hands trembling. "Steel and blood," he muttered, echoing the words of an old instructor. "That's all this war is now." Back on the island, Carter stared at the same burning horizon. The jungle stank of death. The ocean beyond rumbled with distant thunder. He didn't know it, but the struggle for Guadalcanal had only begun, and no man, American or Japanese, would leave unchanged. October 1942. 2 months had passed since the first landings, and Guadalcanal had become a world without mercy. The jungle reeked of smoke, decay, and the sour smell of fear. The ground was soaked through with rain and blood. Henderson Field stood like a scar in the center of the island, surrounded by wrecked planes and mounds of sandbags. It was the heart of the American defense. and the heart the Japanese were determined to cut out. Daniel Carter had stopped counting the days. He worked through heat and darkness, hauling ammunition and fuel drums, patching runways under fire. Sleep came in fragments. Meals were whatever could be scavenged. The men were gaunt, their uniforms torn, their eyes hollow. But they held the line. One night, as monsoon rain hammered the earth, the jungle erupted with gunfire. The Japanese launched a full assault. Thousands of infantry charging through the blackness, screaming "Banzai" as they came. The air trembled under the weight of their fury. Carter grabbed his rifle, firing into the dark until the barrel smoked. The tracers lit the rain like fireflies. Bodies fell in waves. Still they came. At Henderson Field, Lieutenant Raymond Brooks circled above the battle in a low-flying bomber, his searchlights cutting through the storm. Below, the field was chaos. Muzzle flashes strobing through sheets of rain, explosions sending fountains of mud skyward. Over the radio, he heard broken pleas for air support. "We can't hold much longer," someone cried. Brooks angled his plane into a shallow dive and released his bombs along the tree line. The explosions tore the jungle apart, scattering the attackers. Anti-aircraft fire licked at his wings, and a lucky round punched through his right engine. Smoke filled the cockpit. He fought the controls, heart hammering, guiding the crippled aircraft toward the coastline. It hit the beach in a shower of sparks, skidding to a halt near the palm trees. Dazed but alive, Brooks pulled himself out before the plane caught fire. By dawn, the assault had broken. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay silent in the mud. The surviving Americans moved among them, too exhausted to speak. Carter found Brooks slumped against a palm, his flight suit ripped, his face streaked with soot. Recognition flickered between them. Two survivors from different fronts of the same inferno. Carter handed him a canteen without a word. Brooks drank, then looked out at the smoldering jungle. "Did we win?" he asked. Carter glanced at the field, the wrecked trucks, the bodies, the blackened trees. "We're still here," he said quietly. "That's enough." Out at sea, the wrecks of ships smoldered on the horizon, their fires reflected in the dark water. The cost of Guadalcanal had been monstrous, but the island held. For the first time, Japan's advance had stopped dead. As the sun rose over the ruins, the men of Guadalcanal understood the truth of the Pacific War. Victory was not survival. It was endurance, and the ocean would demand it again. The sea off Iwo Jima boiled with the fury of war. In the gray light of dawn, the horizon was a wall of steel. Hundreds of American ships stretching as far as the eye could see, their guns already thundering against the black volcanic island ahead. Each shell struck with the force of an earthquake, sending fountains of ash and rock skyward. The air reeked of cordite and salt. The sea shook beneath the barrage. Daniel Carter stood on the deck of a landing craft, rifle in hand, staring toward the shore. He was older now, his face hardened, his eyes devoid of the naive light they once held at Pearl Harbor. Around him, Marines checked weapons and muttered silent prayers. Some clutched Lucky Charms. Others simply stared at the smoke ahead, knowing luck meant little where they were going. At precisely 9 a.m. on February 19, 1945, the first wave went in. The ramps dropped, and the beach erupted in chaos. Men plunged into waist-deep water, stumbling through surf choked with smoke and floating debris. Japanese artillery opened up from hidden bunkers carved into the volcanic rock, cutting down the first ranks before they reached the sand. Machine guns rattled from the cliffs, a constant metallic scream that tore through the roar of engines and explosions. Carter hit the beach hard, crawling behind a ridge of black sand that offered little cover. The ground was hot beneath his palms. The very island seemed alive with heat and hate. Around him, men were shouting, firing, dying. The air was filled with the hiss of bullets and the deep percussion of naval shells striking the cliffs. Somewhere ahead, an officer waved them forward, and Carter rose, running through a storm of fire that seemed to come from every direction at once. Far above the beach, Lieutenant Raymond Brooks soared through the smoke in his Hellcat fighter, scanning the ground below. His squadron had orders to strafe Japanese strongpoints ahead of the Marines. He dove low, releasing rockets that streaked into a network of caves. The explosions blew black ash across the sky. Pulling up sharply, Brooks caught a glimpse of the beach, a writhing mass of men, fire, and chaos. The radio crackled in his ear. "Eagle 2, stay sharp. Flak heavy over the ridge." "Copy that," Brooks replied, banking hard to avoid an upward burst of anti-aircraft fire. His wingman's plane disintegrated beside him, a fireball swallowed by smoke. For a heartbeat, Brooks felt nothing. No fear, no rage, only the mechanical instinct to keep flying. He leveled out and turned back toward the beach, pressing every ounce of his training into staying alive. Below, Carter's unit pushed forward yard by yard, each step paid for in blood. The sand turned red beneath their boots. The smell of sulfur hung thick in the air. The island wasn't just another battlefield. It was a fortress built on death. And as the first day ended, less than half the landing force had made it beyond the shoreline. But they had a foothold. And in war, that was everything. By the third day on Iwo Jima, the beachhead had become a graveyard. The black volcanic sand swallowed men and machines alike, offering no cover and no comfort. Corpsmen worked in silence, crawling under fire to reach the wounded. The air was a constant scream. Artillery from the ships, mortars from the cliffs, and the unending hiss of machine guns echoing through tunnels beneath the ground. Daniel Carter's uniform was stiff with dried blood and ash. His platoon had been reduced by half. Each advance measured in feet, not yards. The Japanese defenders, hidden in an elaborate web of bunkers and caves, fought like ghosts, unseen, unyielding. Every time an opening was taken, gunfire erupted from another direction. They didn't surrender. They simply disappeared, only to return that night. On the fourth morning, Carter's unit was ordered to push toward Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone that loomed over the island like a dark god. From its heights, the Japanese could see every movement on the beach. Taking it meant survival. Failing meant annihilation. They moved at dawn using smoke as cover. Mortars crashed around them, throwing sand and bone into the air. Carter crawled through craters and trenches, clutching his rifle so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air stank of sulfur and cordite. Ahead, Marines with flamethrowers advanced, their jets of fire turning caves into blazing furnaces. The screams from within were brief, then gone. Overhead, Raymond Brooks flew close support, strafing the slopes with bursts of machine gun fire. The heat rising from the island distorted the air, warping the horizon. From above, the battle looked like a living nightmare. Men swarming over black terrain, while explosions bloomed like sick flowers. His squadron had been flying non-stop for 72 hours, their planes patched together with tape and faith. Brooks's own Hellcat bore bullet holes along its wing, oil leaking in slow streams. "Eagle 1, this is Control," the radio cracked. "Ground forces closing on Suribachi. Keep them covered." "Copy," Brooks answered, banking his aircraft toward the mountain. He dove low, releasing his last rockets into a nest of machine guns. The explosions sent plumes of smoke spiraling upward. He pulled back sharply, watching the Marines crawl higher along the slope, small figures in a world of chaos. By noon, Carter's squad reached the base of Mount Suribachi. The ground trembled with every blast. "Keep moving," someone shouted. They climbed inch by inch, using jagged rock for cover. The higher they went, the louder the wind grew, mingling with the distant roar of engines and gunfire. Near the summit, Carter's sergeant took a sniper's round through the chest. Carter dragged him behind a ridge, but the man was gone before he hit the ground. For a long moment, Carter just stared, breathing hard, the world reduced to sound, wind, fire, and his own heartbeat. Then he stood, raised his rifle, and kept climbing. Below, the mountain bled smoke into the sea. Above, planes screamed across the sky. The island was breaking but not yet beaten. February 23rd, 1945. The morning broke over Iwo Jima under a sky of pale gray. The thunder of artillery had dulled to sporadic bursts, and smoke drifted lazily from the flanks of Mount Suribachi. For the first time in a week, the air held more silence than noise. Along the slopes, Marines moved cautiously, clearing caves with grenades and flamethrowers, methodically, grimly. The Japanese were still fighting, but their gunfire had grown ragged, desperation replacing discipline. Daniel Carter reached the summit just before noon. His boots slid in the black ash as he pulled himself over the last ledge. Around him, a handful of Marines gathered, panting, eyes wide in disbelief. Below them stretched the island, miles of torn sand and burning wrecks, a landscape carved by hell. From this height, Carter could see the Pacific glittering in the distance, dotted with the silhouettes of American ships. For a moment, he said nothing. The battle still raged below, but up here the noise seemed distant, like thunder beyond the horizon. A corporal approached carrying a folded flag wrapped in plastic. "Orders from command," he said quietly. "Raise it." Together they climbed a short ridge of rock and iron, a makeshift pole already waiting. Carter held the flag as the others secured it in place. The wind caught it instantly, the stars and stripes unfurling in slow motion, bright against the gray sky. For a heartbeat, the mountain held its breath. Then from the beach far below, a sound rose, a roar of voices, the kind born from exhaustion and awe. Men cheered, cried, dropped to their knees. Some saluted through tears. Others simply stared, unable to speak. It wasn't triumph they felt, but release, a momentary lifting of the weight that had crushed them for years. Far above, Lieutenant Raymond Brooks banked his aircraft to the west and saw the flash of color atop Suribachi. He didn't need the radio to tell him what it meant. "They did it," he whispered. He flew lower, tipping his wing toward the summit before turning back out to sea. Below, the flag shimmered in the sun, small, fragile, defiant. But the war was not over. The fighting on Iwo Jima would rage for weeks more. Every cave, every tunnel had to be cleared by hand. Carter fought through them all, his face hollow, his movements automatic. The men no longer spoke of victory, only survival. By the time the island was declared secure in March, more than 26,000 were dead. When Brooks returned to his carrier, he found orders waiting. A new mission over the Japanese mainland. Whispers spread among the crew. The next step was Okinawa, and beyond that, the end. Neither he nor Carter knew the shape that end would take, only that it was coming fast, brighter and deadlier than anything the world had ever seen. As the sun sank into the Pacific, Carter sat on the ridge of Suribachi, watching the flag ripple in the fading light. Around him lay silence, broken only by the wind and the distant rumble of waves. He thought of the first dawn at Pearl Harbor, of ships burning on the water, and now this new dawn, born from ruin. The circle was closing. The war that began in fire would end in light, the kind that left no shadows. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor to the black sands of Iwo Jima, America's spirit was tested and reborn. Millions fought, thousands fell, and through their sacrifice, a new world rose from the smoke. The Pacific no longer burned, but its echoes remain, carried by the waves and the memories of those who stood and endured. If this story moved you, honor their courage. Like, share, and subscribe to keep history alive. Every click helps us tell the stories of those who turned darkness into dawn.